Hello everyone, welcome to my next lesson on practical coastal navigation. First, I need to state my standard disclaimer. These navigation videos are for educational and explanatory purposes only. They are not intended to guarantee your safety on the water. Nothing, including these videos, can take the place of accredited courses from qualified instructors and developing your own navigation skills over time. You are responsible for choosing destinations and cruising areas that are within your own level of experience and ability. Any charts you may see in this video are not for navigation purposes. They may be out of date, and they are for explanation purposes only. When you go out on the water, you are enjoying yourself at your own risk. This lesson is about following magnetic transit lines to avoid rocks and shallows. In the last lesson, we used magnetic clearing bearings to mark off areas of safe water. In this lesson, we'll draw magnetic transit lines onto a chart that we wish to follow directly to find our way through hazardous areas. Oftentimes, when you're entering a harbor, there may be two beacons set up on land, one behind the other, to help you find your way safely into the harbor. These are called range lines. Here's an example entering Nanaimo Harbor. These two light signals can be lined up and followed into the harbor. You can proceed tangentially until the beacons line up, and then turn and follow the line safely into the harbor, while keeping the two beacons lined up visually. The line to these two lights is marked 254 degrees. That will be degrees true. But if there are no transit ranges set up, you can use just one target beacon on nearby land, and draw a line on a chart from the beacon along a safe path into a harbor or through a hazardous area. Work out the magnetic bearing of this line, and then you can follow it into the harbor or through a hazardous area, taking sightings on it with your handheld compass. But before we look at an example of that, I'll quickly remind you of the different types of magnetic bearings we have to keep separate in our minds so that we don't get confused, which I also covered in my last lesson. This is your boat's heading. This is what your ship's compass gives you as your magnetic heading. The magnetic heading is the magnetic direction that your boat is pointing in. But if you're in a tidal current that's carrying you in a slightly different direction, this may be your track over the ground. Your GPS can display this either as your true or magnetic course over the ground, or COG. And lastly, you may choose to take a sighting with a handheld compass on a target beacon on nearby land. Here is a magnetic sighting to a target beacon. This sighting is taken with a handheld compass. We'll call this a magnetic sighting, and it constantly changes as your boat moves. Here, your boat is progressing on its track over the ground, and the magnetic sighting to the target beacon is constantly changing, while your magnetic heading and track remain constant. So, in this discussion, it's important not to confuse your boat's magnetic heading, given by your ship's compass, with a magnetic sighting to a target beacon taken with a handheld compass. Okay, now let's look at a magnetic transit line and see exactly what that is. Let's say you're proceeding along the coast and you want to turn here into the north end of Howe Sound, between the mainland and Keats Island. This channel is called Shoal Channel. Maybe that name by itself might alert you to the dangers there. The deepest part of the way in is only 2 meters above chart datum, and it's surrounded by areas even shallower, and there are lots of dangerous rocks. If your boat has a draft of around 6 feet, you can't get through here at all at lower tides, and you shouldn't attempt to transit this channel with less than about 3 meters of tide, and with a lot of advanced navigation experience. The use of transit lines in situations like this is part of the advanced cruising standard. But to get through here safely when there is sufficient tide, the edge of this steep bluff cliff is a good reference beacon approaching the channel. So you can draw a magnetic transit line here through the deepest part of the channel using this cliff as the target beacon. After checking this against the compass rose and correcting the magnetic bearing of this line to the current year, I've written down 354 degrees magnetic beside the line. Now, don't use my numbers here. You've got to do your own chart work. This is an example only. Okay, this is where you need your handheld compass. As you're proceeding along the coast, you need to be taking compass sightings on this cliff. If you're approaching from the north, like this, your initial sighting will be greater than 354 degrees magnetic, but the sighting will decrease as you continue towards the transit line. When the sighting reaches 354 degrees magnetic, then you can turn and follow this transit line in. So, that's a magnetic transit line. It's a magnetic line you can follow through an area of hazards to stay in safe water. But you have to be careful here. If there's a tidal current, it can push you off to one side into a dangerous area. If that happens, there are a couple of pitfalls to watch out for. Let's take a look at what can go wrong and carefully consider the corrective action you need to take. Let's say you think you're following this magnetic transit line towards the cliff like this. But after a while, perhaps the current has pushed you off to the south like this. One mistake that's easy to make is to just continue on your way while keeping your boat pointed at the target beacon, without realizing the current is pushing you off to one side into a dangerous area. So you need to keep an eye on your ship's compass while you're heading towards the target beacon and make sure it is not slowly deviating from the magnetic bearing of the transit line that you marked on the chart. In this example, while you are still pointing at your target beacon, your ship's compass has decreased below 354 magnetic. You may be pointing at the target beacon, but if your ship's compass is not reading 354 degrees magnetic, you're not on the transit line. Looking at the chart, it's clear you need to turn to port to get back to the transit line. But down in the water, it's not so obvious. The only indication you have that you've drifted off the transit line is that your ship's compass now reads less than 354 degrees magnetic. Your first instinct may be to turn to a higher magnetic heading, like this, because your bearing to the target beacon is less than 354. But that's turning the wrong way. To get back to the transit line, you actually need to turn to an even lower magnetic heading, like this. This is where it can be very confusing. You need to make sure you've thought this through in advance when you're making up your passage plan. This isn't the only mistake to watch out for. Another mistake is to just stay on your magnetic heading of 354 without noticing that after a while your boat is no longer pointing at the target beacon. It's not enough to just keep pointing at your target beacon, nor is it enough just to keep your magnetic heading. You must be both pointing at your target beacon while your ship's compass reads, in this example, 354 degrees magnetic. Here your boat is still maintaining a magnetic heading of 354 degrees magnetic, but the current has pushed you to the south and you're no longer pointing at your target beacon. Here it's a little more obvious which way you need to turn because you're still maintaining a heading of 354 degrees magnetic, but your target beacon you can see is now off to your port. So turn to your port, get out your handheld compass, and take sightings again until you're back on the transit line. In these examples, a very experienced navigator may choose to alter their heading slightly if they found that there's a current constantly pushing them off course. Here, holding a heading slightly to port to counteract the current may help you stay on your transit line. Your GPS may report your magnetic course over the ground matches the transit line you want to stay on, even though your heading is slightly less, maybe by about 4 or 5 degrees. But keep your handheld compass constantly pointing at the target to verify this, since your ship's bow is now no longer pointing at the target beacon. You can also use the same magnetic transit line to head out of an area. Get onto the transit line by taking reverse sightings with your handheld compass. Then, turn your boat to the reciprocal bearing on your ship's compass. But here, you'll need to take regular sightings back to the target bearing to make sure you haven't drifted off the transit line. You won't get any other indications because you're heading out to open water. So it's more critical to continue checking with your handheld compass that you haven't drifted off the transit line. Now I mentioned at the end of the last lesson that we can also use 2 target beacons and 2 magnetic transit lines to set up a safe turning point. Let's go back to the example of entering Silva Bay to look at that. Here is the entrance to Silva Bay. This time we'll set up a magnetic transit line to the first target beacon like this. Again, we can obtain its magnetic bearing from the compass rose, correct it to the current year, and write down 220 degrees magnetic on the line. So you can follow this line in, but when can we turn into the bay and be sure we're past the dangerous reef just south of Acorn Island? Well, here's another target beacon on Shipyard Rock. We can draw another transit line towards Shipyard Rock like this. This line will take us safely by the reef. This line is 267 degrees magnetic, corrected to the current year. There are some shallows along this line, but they're still 3 to 4 meters below chart datum, so that's pretty good clearance even at low tide. So let's say we're approaching Silva Bay on this first transit line. As Shipyard Rock comes into view, we can start to take sightings on it with our handheld compass. The initial sighting will be less than 267 degrees, but the sighting will be increasing as we continue along the first magnetic transit line. But we'll also continue to take sightings to the first target beacon to make sure we're not drifting off our first transit line. As soon as our sighting to Shipyard Rock reaches 267 degrees magnetic, we can turn and point towards it. The intersection of our two transit lines is our turning point. As we get closer to Shipyard Rock, we can just continue our way on in visually, being careful to keep this port hand can to our port before we turn into the inner bay. There can still be a strong current here, so you need to watch for any sideways motion of your boat to stay off the shoals on either side. And you need to carefully judge your position away from the rocks and shoals visually. Things are happening too fast, and everything is too close for you to spend time trying to take more compass bearings. Okay, that's the end of this lesson. I hope that was all clear. But let me reiterate a couple of important considerations that I also mentioned in my last lesson. When you're using a handheld compass, make sure you're clear of all magnetic influences. Radios, for example, can influence compass readings. And most importantly, the most common mistake I see students make is that they're not sighting at the beacon they think they are. Double-check all surrounding features of the land and other nearby beacons and make sure it all makes sense, and that what you're sighting is truly what you think it is.